of the readings this week comes from Ulrich Neisser's book, Cognition and Reality. And in the first chapter, Neisser outlines kind of the overall take and scope of what is known as cognitive psychology. Now, Neisser is considered to be the father of cognitive psychology, so let's take a look at what he says this field should accomplish and what it should study. So we'll first start with the question, what is cognition? For Neisser, cognition is knowledge, and knowledge is acquired through experience. But where does experience arise from? Where does it come from? From perception. We perceive the world around us. We experience it via our senses. Thus, for Neisser, cognition, that is our understanding of the world around us, begins with perception. Perception makes cognition possible. But cognition also influences perception as well. It's a dual arrow relationship. In other words, one doesn't help or support the other, they both work in conjunction. One of the quotes from this chapter reads, "Cognition is the activity of knowing, that is the acquisition, organization, and use of knowledge." Now note how he describes this process. Cognition is something that organisms do. This is an active, not a passive activity. Cognition is an activity, an ongoing process that perceiving organisms do as they engage with the world around them. So historically, psychology has studied mental processes. That's what our field is known for studying. And it began with introspection. And this led up to the 1930s when it started to fall out of favor. Now, introspection is highly individualized. That is, it's a very unique individual process that we go through. And the process here is unreliable in the sense that it differs from person to person. It's very difficult to find consistencies or similarities using introspection. So while the common critique of why introspection has fallen out of favor was due to this unreliability, that is, this inconsistency, everybody reported a different account, even if they were experiencing, quote, the same process. So when they were exposed to different sensations, whether that was a sound or a light, they reported perceiving different things. So Neisser points to an even larger concern. That is, beyond just the unreliable accounts, it lacked ecological validity. That is, it neglected people's everyday involvement with the world. Introspection looks at what's going on inside one's mind, and in so doing, it neglects what's going on out in the world around us. So what introspection neglected was how we develop socially and culturally. Our perception of the world is influenced by our social and cultural contexts. For example, from birth, we can hear all human sounds, but as we're exposed to our native language, we lose the ability to hear and distinguish between sounds in other languages. Even our ability to see a two-dimensional object as three-dimensional, that is, say, a drawing of a Necker cube on a piece of paper, we can see it as a three-dimensional object. This is culturally influenced. This is a process that we learn throughout our lives. It's not something that we're innately born with. What we pay attention to, whether that's the foreground or the background, is also culturally situated as well. That social cultural milieu in which we find ourselves has a large role in shaping what we perceive and what we pay attention to, that in turn influences our cognitive development, what we think about, how we think about it, when we think about it. Now, historically, psychology up until this point, until the 1930s, had neglected how we're driven by unconscious processes and how our behavior is shaped by experiences. These became the two main points of view following the demise of introspection. So introspection was replaced by psychoanalysis and behaviorism, and both have very different thoughts on the role and importance of cognition and mental processes. For Freud, the mental activity that we are aware of, that is, conscious activity, comprises only a very small part of the mind. For Freud and psychoanalysis, we are largely driven by unconscious motives and drives, that is, cognitions that we are not aware of. Now, for the behaviorists, Watson and Skinner in particular, our behavior is not shaped by our thought processes or mental activity, but instead associations and consequences out in the world. Any mental activity that accompanies our behavior is said to have no consequence or any bearing on our behavior. That is, our behavior is largely determined by associations and consequences of the environment. Where did that leave the field of psychology? Cognition and other cognitive topics, including perception, attention, memory, thinking, and even language development, were relegated to just a few camps in the field. Gestalt psychology comes to mind. They were studying perception. Piaget studied cognitive development, and memory studies at the time lacked ecological validity. They were influenced largely by the behaviorist camp. This all changed with the cognitive revolution in the 60s and the 70s. The advent of the computer gave rise to a new set of terms to understand the mind. Cognition came bursting onto the scene, but Neisser warns of its lack of ecological validity, lest it too fall prey to the same concerns that afflicted the introspection techniques before it. Now make note that Neisser is writing this book in 1976, and we can say that these specific fears that he have not yet come to pass. Cognitive psychology is still around more than 40 years later, but we have another equally concerning trend arising with the advancement of brain imaging. With ever greater precision and detail, neuroscience is quickly gaining in popularity. Cognitive psychology may not disappear as Neisser feared, but it may be subsumed by cognitive neuroscience. With the ability to look inside our brains, are we looking at the mind? Are we seeing mental processes on the screen? Are we seeing people's thoughts, feelings, or motivations? The central question we must ask is, does cognitive psychology have something to add that is distinct, separate, and worth being a field in its own right? So let's take a look at the 4 goals that cognitive psychology should study according to Neisser. The first is that cognition is located in the everyday world. That is, we should be focused on our thoughts about the world in which we find ourselves. This ties in with his concern with ecological validity of cognitive psychology. If we're not focused on everyday life, of what use or value are cognitive theories? The second point is that cognitive psychology should focus on the world in which we live. Studies that are conducted in a laboratory setting are divorced from the lived world. How we respond to various controlled stimuli in a lab setting may have very little to do with and provide very little insight into the world that we perceive, the world that we sense, and the world that we're thinking about. The third point is that cognitive psychology should be up to the task of the complexity of cognition. That is, cognition, understanding, and thinking is a complex process. Reductionism, that is the ability to explain something complex in terms of its simplest components, is often valued and pursued by science. We should be mindful of doing a disservice to our subject matter. Complexity in itself is not something to necessarily be avoided. Cognition is complex, and it's deserving of a complex theory to fully understand it. The fourth point is that cognitive psychology should address fundamental questions. In order to begin the task of understanding cognition, we should begin with basic fundamental questions that underlie cognition and perception. Which brings us to the second question: what about perception? Now, these 2 quotes, I think, exemplify Neisser's take on this. The first states perceiving is the basic cognitive activity out of which all others must emerge. Notice that perception is itself a cognition. I think this describes the active process as well as the interconnection with cognition. Perception and cognition are two sides of the same coin. He's well known for this quote that describes or encapsulates his understanding of this process. He says, quote, "Perception is where cognition and reality meet," which I think encapsulates the entire book. Neisser hopes that cognitive psychology can better understand this encounter. So let's take a closer look at one of the prevailing views of consciousness today, and that's the notion of the black box of consciousness, in which we more or less serve as input-output machines. And hear the echoes of the computer metaphor here. When we encounter the world, sensory information comes in, and we process that in our brains and then behave based on the output. But what happens inside consciousness is not well understood, but the focus is on what happens inside the perceiver. In other words, we're looking at the mental brain activity that is going on. But there's only an inside if there's also an outside, and the neglect of the world here and the encounter that we have with the world has led to many unanswered questions, chief among them being the impossibility of creating meaning out of nothing. If we are encountering meaningless stimuli that we're just passively picking up in the environment, where does meaning arise if those passive stimuli are devoid of meaning in the first place? If the world is filled with meaningless chaos and the perceiver is said to make sense of it all, how does a bunch of nothings ever add up to something? Now, the flip side of this overemphasis on the perceiver and what's going on the inside, that is the information processing view, is to turn this around and instead focus on the outside, that is the world. Enter Gibson and his theory of affordances. Gibson is one example of this shift of focusing on the outside. Gibson claims that all the perceptual information available is already contained in the stimulus itself out in the world. In short, the perceiver contributes nothing to the equation. All possible opportunities and perceptions of the environment are already contained in the perceived object. While Gibson does acknowledge the relationship between a perceiver and thing perceived, in that what an object affords or offers dually implies both the organism perceiving and the stimulus perceived, the affordance itself is contained ultimately in the stimulus. It's not brought by, added onto, or given by the perceiving organism. Carefully consider what this means. Gibson is locating the offering out in the world, that all value and meaning are afforded by the world itself. And while a specific perceiver has specific affordances, all the opportunities and possibilities ultimately arise from the world. Which ones emerge are tied to the organism, but they arise from the world, from the object, from the stimulus. Yet our access to the world is via our senses, our perceptual engagement with the world. There's nothing to perceive without a perceiver. How would I know if the world offers an affordance apart from my experience of it? Likewise, there is no perceiver without something to perceive. And it is in this meeting, this joining of a perceiver and something perceived, that meaning emerges. The affordances are not there beforehand, or whether they are or not is not possible to find out, for as soon as something is perceived, it is already made manifest. What something is apart from my cognition of it is ultimately unanswerable. As soon as I start thinking about it, it's no longer outside of my cognition of it. Let's take a closer look at this quote from Neisser. He tells us that, quote, "Perception and cognition are usually not just operations in the head, but transactions with the world. These transactions do not merely inform the perceiver, they also transform them." So notice how he dismisses and critiques both Gibson, who claims that these are out in the world, or the information processing view where they are operations in the head. He instead remarks that this is a process, an activity, this notion of transformation. It's our engagement with the world as active perceivers that we're not just passively taking in information that's already out there, but we are changed in the process. I would also offer an additional transformation as well, not just the perceiver being transformed, but this transaction also takes place out in the world. The world changes as well. It's in the meeting of the two that both are transformed. And to end this chapter, let's consider this quote. Each of us is created by the cognitive acts in which they engage. Think about how our thoughts shape who we are. What are we looking at here? Is this just a bunch of cardboard boxes that are made to look like buildings? Or is this a modern art installation? It depends on one's understanding and thoughts about what counts as art. What we see, hear, smell, taste, or even feel are not passive sensory impressions, but are actively taken up from one's position, one's understanding of the world, shaping what we see. Our perception of the world is active, and our understanding of the world is transformative.